Thank you, Sandy. Thank you to all of you. I don't know if I would have braved the evening to come out and listen to a bunch of speakers tonight, but I'm really grateful that you did. I just moved to Santa Fe 3 months ago, and so it is a lot like Fairbanks, Alaska, actually, funnily enough. And I'm really enjoying it here, and it's just a pleasure to meet other people who care about the globe while we're here. I'm going to start with 2 vignettes, but then my job is to take us way out. So we started as close to the ground as you can get, really working with the poor in these places. I'm going to take you way back to give some scope, and then Sandy's going to play cleanup batter and pull it all home. So the 2 vignettes are this. I started my career in the Soviet Union in 1991. And I was working there in a building that was beautiful in St. Petersburg, middle of the city, but it happened to be right above the biggest mafia casino in all of St. Petersburg, which we didn't know when we got our offices there. And every day, we would walk to work past a set of kiosks that had just opened because it was just the moment of privatization and people were finally figuring out buying and selling, and these kiosks would generally smuggle things in, Nutella, diapers, all sorts of things, and then sell them. And every day, a different kiosk would be burned. And they were getting burned down because the mafia was asking them for protection money. And if they didn't pay up, they wouldn't continue their business. 8 years later, I found myself in India, in a rural village in Uttar Pradesh, which is northern part of India, quite poor, a lot of caste issues, like what you were saying in Nepal. And in one of the villages that I was working in, we were doing microfinance, small microcredit, things like that. It was early days of that. And it wasn't working very well. The landlords fought very hard against building businesses that would get the wage laborers to have other sources of income, because the landlords wanted to keep wages down. And if people had bicycle shops or barber shops or little things, then they could pull away from the wage system, and the remaining laborers could ask for more money. It was not in the landlord's interest. And so what we found in some of the villages was that Dalit women, who were untouchables, that group of women, were getting raped by the landlords. And the rape was a way of saying, don't you dare pull out of our economic system, because this is what's going to happen to you. And those 2 things sent me on my career, which was that I cared deeply about human rights and international development. But I thought that the field was missing some of the problems that were holding these places back. And you're going to hear a lot of echoes between me and Kate, because a lot of what I found was that these people were not poor and ignorant and unable to solve their own problems. They were tremendous sources of ability and solutions. They were being held back by other things. And that's actually the trajectory that the international field of aid has gone through. So if you think about World War II and the moment when the US, but also the World Bank and other institutions started to give aid, it was a moment like this. We were giving a man a fish, right? We were giving away things. And the idea was, places in Europe were bombed out and they were momentarily poor, but if you just gave them a little help, they would get back on their feet. Well, that worked okay for Europe, although the Marshall Plan was a lot more complicated than that. It did work okay. But as we turned to other countries, it didn't seem to work. These countries weren't getting better with just handouts. They weren't getting better when we built dams or roads. Things that we thought would work just weren't working that well. And so we said, oh, well, maybe the problem isn't to give a man a fish, it's to teach a man to fish. And so we started to say, well, these places aren't just poor, they're also ignorant. And the global community of international technocrats with fancy degrees and a lot of education and a lot of desire to do good started to go around the world and teach people how to do things. And this is what Kate was, in a much nicer way, criticizing, was all these technocrats would go out and say, oh, you don't know how to do farming, you don't know how to do the building of a dam, we'll show you how to do this, and we'll lend you money to do this, and then you can do this. But there was a real problem with that prescription. And the problem was that these people were not actually so ignorant. People are tremendous sources of ability in themselves. And what we found more recently in the last decade or so, it was that there were a lot of obstacles to fishing. People knew how to fish. They'd been fishing for 1,000 years. They'd been doing agriculture in their area for a long time. They knew their soil. But there were a lot of things that were blocking them. And our job was to remove those obstacles. It was to come in as sidekicks, as partners to the people on the ground, and try to take away the things that were getting in the way of them developing themselves. And it turned out there were a number of things in the way that we never really considered part of international development. So the biggest thing in the way was war and conflict. The United Nations passed what they called the Millennium Development Goals a number of years ago, and they were a series of international development goals that were supposed to be reached by the year 2000, hence millennium. And they were passed at the millennium. They were supposed to be reached quite recently. And what they found was that countries in conflict did not meet a single one of the Millennium Development Goals. Lots of other countries did. We've had actually tremendous success in development. It's one of those untold stories. Everyone likes to criticize international development. In fact, the world has gotten much less poor, much more literate, much more healthy. All of the statistics have gone up quite a bit, but not in countries at war. War is the number one way that any country can slide down the ladder of development absolutely as quick as possible. But international development hadn't really considered war and conflict part of our ambit before. Now we do. Another thing that was holding a lot of countries back was corruption and greed and the leaders of these countries. And this is something we're really a little tenuous about talking about. It's hard to talk about corruption at the top or the greed of leaders when you're a country that needs to do business directly with another country. So if you're making your loans directly to the government, if you're working with that other government diplomatically, when I was working at the State Department doing advice, it's pretty awkward to look at your counterpart across the table or you're sitting down and basically know that that group of people is robbing their country blind and that the real reason that those people are poor is because of that. And it's actually hard for people to believe sometimes. So I was writing a report about Guatemala recently, and my copy editor at my think tank, I had written that there was a road that was proposed to a port that would have helped a port city become much wealthier. They needed a road that would connect the businesses to the port, to build the port, to enable them to do business. It made a lot of sense, and it was being blocked by a business group in front of another port. They had a monopoly. They didn't want a second port to open up. It would have hurt their business, and so they were blocking this road. And the copy editor said, when? She wanted a year, because she assumed that this problem had been solved. It had started 100 years ago when the road was first proposed. And I said, well, there's still no road. Those business leaders still have no reason to give up their monopoly on business and open a new road. And you see that in many, many places. There's an assumption that, of course, everyone wants to develop. It's just poverty and ignorance, and they don't know how. But when you actually get into these countries, you see there's a lot of people who don't necessarily want fair and even development. So it could be upper caste people who don't trust or don't like lower caste people. In Afghanistan, there were an awful lot of people who didn't want 6-year-old girls to get an education. It seems crazy, but a lot of people felt that that was not right in their religious hierarchy. There are often people who want to maintain control over business resources, and so they don't want to expand the pie. I was working in Ghana recently. Ghana is a democracy. It's actually a fairly developed place for a lot of countries in Africa, but they just discovered oil. And as you might guess, a number of people would like to monopolize that oil money and make sure that procurement contracts with the government to do that oil go straight to them. And so there's a big fight about how open, how transparent, things like that. So you have war, you have people within countries who don't want those countries to develop, and then you have society at large. And for a long time, the international development community basically treated society like it was this poor woman on the tracks, just crying for help, and how can we help? And we would come in like Evel Knievel and save the day. That is not what we've actually found about societies in these countries. Instead, if you look right now, Kate said the biggest source of money for development was regular people, not the government. Absolutely true. Within regular people, what is the number one source for development money? It's remittances from immigrants. The number one way that places get wealthier is because people from their countries who have moved elsewhere are giving money back. That's self-help. Another way that places are getting wealthier is because regular people are giving other people money, sometimes through foundations, and sometimes through things like Kiva, just direct lending. You find someone who's worthy of your trust, and you directly give them money. There's a whole series of new ways that we found to do international development. Now, some of that work is helping people get educated, helping people get the skills to build their own capacity. And there's really interesting ways that this is starting to happen. Some countries have pioneered bonds. Basically, you invest in young people to get an education, and those young people pay you back, kind of like you're doing the college loan. Really interesting new economic models for how you invest in people. But sometimes it's a little more complicated. Sometimes people are fighting much deeper forces. They're fighting inimical groups that would like to hold back that kind of education. And in those cases, it's up to us to help people organize, to help people fight those forces. And that's a touchier thing. It's much harder than just giving some money to somebody to do something simple and good. You know, it's pretty clear to say, oh, help a 6-year-old girl get an education, that's development. It's much more touchy to say, help a country start a revolution, that's development. But if you're looking at, say, the Republic of Georgia, which is where this picture comes from, a country that broke away from the Soviet Union, got mired in civil war, fell into a really deep level of corruption that brought it back to a place, well, the joke in Georgia was, what did Georgia have before electricity, or before candles? And the joke was electricity. Sorry, that was a poorly told joke. But basically, they went way backward. And the way to help that country develop was to help them have what was the Rose Revolution, so that they could have cleaner government. And there's a lot of complicated parts of the Georgia story I'm happy to get into. But the progress wouldn't have started until they got rid of the leaders that were at the top. In other cases, it's about holding our own government accountable. If our government is fueling wars in other countries, if our government is doing things that are supporting some of the bad actors. Right now, the United States government is supporting a war in Yemen that Saudi Arabia, our ally, is launching. We can discuss whether that's good or bad, but one thing is for sure, Yemen is one of the poorest countries on earth, and that war is not helping it become any wealthier. And finally, sometimes we need to get more involved. This is Syria. And some of the really hard questions we need to ask ourselves is not when do we refrain from war, but when would that have been a better thing? When I was on the State Department's advisory group, one of the things we were advising Kerry early on was to set up no-fly zones, do things that would help people in Syria have some succor from the rebellion. And you can disagree with that, you can agree with that, but I think as we move in to the next realm of development, these are the tough questions we need to ask ourselves. It's not just, how do we help that little girl get an education? That's essential, but it's easy. It's, how do we hold our government to account? What's our role in helping other citizens empower themselves so they can hold their governments to account? And when is it time to make our government intervene? When is it time to have our government step back? Those are the tougher, deeper questions that I hope we can all get into in the Q&A. Thank you.